I want to welcome everyone here tonight, 18 November, and it's kind of a cool evening here in Texas. And um, we'll begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commands and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. All right. I think we would start out now. Where we are right now is we're about here in the 57, 58 AD, that time frame right here where Paul is imprisoned. So we're in that time frame right here, and just to kind of let you know, Nero is in Rome, and this is about where Paul writes First and Second Corinthians and Romans and so forth. So let's go ahead with a recap so that we know where we are in relationship to what's happening with everything. Remember that Paul had come back off his third missionary journey. He had been asked to take on a vow with 4 other men so that they would everyone would understand that he is still Jewish, and he's not taking on. Well, he didn't convert to anything. He's still very much Jewish, and he's still teaching Judaism the way it should be done. And so that was why they asked him to take on this vow and pay for the sacrifices that these 4 other gentlemen would be required to give at the end of their vow. So Paul had gone through all of that. He was in the temple, and pretty much at the end of this vow session, and he was arrested and accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. Now, he was accused by people from Corinth who were troublemakers. And so the Romans saw that there was a big riot going on, and they were just about to beat Paul up. In fact, they were beating him. So the Roman soldiers came in and rescued Paul, and then pulled him back. And Paul asked him he said, "Look, can I talk to these guys? Can I address them?" So from a safe perch, he spoke to the people in Aramaic about what it was another opportunity for him to preach the gospel. So he did all right, and but then they didn't like some of the things that he said, so they started rioting again, and the Romans pulled him back, and so Paul was going to be the Roman commander says, "Well, we'll just beat it out of him. What the problem with Paul is, I don't have an answer as to why they're rioting, so we'll just beat Paul up and ourselves with the scourge." And that's when Paul said, "Okay, is it okay? Is it illegal for you to beat a Roman citizen?" And so that got everybody's attention. And so he was then allowed to address the Sanhedrin, and because then that way maybe they could find out some kind of a reason. So anyway, they went to and addressed the Sanhedrin, and so there again it was just contentious, and that's when the had the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, had someone next to Paul slap him because he didn't like what he said, and so then Paul kind of snapped back at him, and then they said, "Don't you know this is the high priest?" And he said, "No, I didn't." So anyway, as it turned out, it was contentious. And the Roman commander there decided, okay, enough of this. We're going to send him to the governor in Caesarea. And so he moved the case over to Caesarea in the middle of the night. and kind of surprised the Jews, because they were the Jewish leaders, because they had planned to kill Paul when he next appeared before the Sanhedrin on his way to meet them. They were going to have a group of assassins. In fact, 40 of them had vowed not to eat or drink until Paul was dead. So anyway, they moved the case to Caesarea uh, to Felix. Okay, so let's go ahead with that's where we are right now, and we'll go ahead with the lesson, or with the scriptures for this week in Acts 24. After 5 days, the Kohen Gadol, Ananias, came down with some of the elders and an attorney named Tertullus. They brought formal charges against Paul and before the governor. Now, the Sanhedrin, they really wanted to get to Paul, and so here Paul was taken out away from them in the middle of the night, and so it was so obvious that they wanted to get him. It took them 5 days. Okay, it's a 2-day trip from Jerusalem up to Caesarea, and so somehow they had gotten an attorney and developed their case all, and made it over there to Caesarea in 5 days. So that meant that they'd only had like 3 days to put together their case. And so the fact that the high priest himself traveled to Caesarea kind of shows that, boy, they really were serious. They wanted to get Paul. And then he brought up a bunch of elders with him from the Sanhedrin. And then they brought this lawyer, Tertullus, who was known for his skill in rhetoric and just his gift of speaking. So anyway, they got it all together, and they came up to Felix in Caesarea. Now, when Paul was called in, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "We are enjoying much peace through you, and reforms are introduced for this nation because of your foresight. We acknowledge this, most excellent Felix, in every way and every place with all gratitude. But in order that I may not weary you any longer, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly." All right, now, so this guy Tertullus, he starts out with the speech. Now, he is probably a Hellenistic Jew, and he's got a Roman name, so he may have been he could have very well been a Roman Gentile. We don't really know, but his title, he was an attorney, and he was supposed to be very good at rhetoric and speaking, as a good public speaker. And in fact, they call him attorney. The Greek word for that is rheteros, and that's kind of where we get our terms today of rhetoric, and just he was a word mechanic, as it were. So the flattery that he started out with, that they generally, when you're speaking to these ancient potentates, they would always use these flowery speeches, and that was very fashionable during Paul's day. And he heaped praise on Felix. He even called him most excellent Felix, which is normally applied to someone who was a higher rank than just a governor of a province there in the Roman Empire. And so, but Felix was he brought peace, but he brought peace basically by being a very fierce ruler. You can bring peace, as it were, but by just killing anybody that even raises their hand to ask a question, and eventually you're going to cow the population, and that's kind of way that that Felix ruled. And so his peace was kind of a result of terror and rather than tranquility. So Tertullus praised Felix for being a peacemaker in preparation for the charge that he was bringing up against Paul, that Paul was a disturber of the peace. So he's trying to play the two things, calling Felix the peacemaker and Paul being a peace breaker. So, and he was like a lot of people today, where they say they promise to be brief, and generally speaking, they are not. And so we go into the verses 5 and 6. For we have found this man to be a pest, stirring up riots among all the Jewish people throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. He even tried to defile the temple, but we seized him. Now, Tertullus had three specific charges against Paul. He had a personal charge, which was heresy, a political charge against him for treason, and a religious charge of sacrilege. First, he was a pest and a troublemaker. He stirs up dissension throughout the Roman Empire, and he stirred up the Jews wherever he went. Now, this was a serious charge, because the Romans thought to they sought to preserve peace wherever, and so Jewish uprising were actually a perennial problem for the Romans. And so here, if Paul is accused of being a troublemaker, that's going to get the attention of the Roman governor. Second, Tertullus pictured Paul as a leader of a cult outside mainstream Judaism. Now, the Roman Empire tolerated Judaism, but the sect of the Nazarenes, Tertullus contends, is not part of Judaism, and so that's where he said they should not enjoy the privileges and the rights of a normal regular Jew, because they were outside of Judaism. Now, he called the sect the sect of the Nazarenes, and this is kind of unique, because it's the only place in that the Messianic movement was called the Nazarenes in the New Testament. That's the only place, and it's coming from this lawyer. So evidently Tertullus he used this name to make the way, which was what the Messianic movement was actually called. He wanted to make the way sound as bad as possible. Now, the second charge coupled Paul with Messianic movements, and the Romans knew, what havoc a false Messiah could cause, and they could whip people up into a frenzy and have an uprising, and the only way to settle that was with killing a bunch of people. So the Romans were very sensitive to the idea of what's the latest, the next messianic person to come along. If you'll remember, later on after Paul, you'd have the Bar Kokhba revolution and revolt, and so Bar Kokhba was also called by Rabbi Akiva as the Messiah, looking to the fact that he was a military guy who was going to relieve, free the Jews from the oppression of the Romans. So the first two charges gave the impression that Paul was guilty of sedition against Rome, and the Jews had similarly, they also charged Yeshua with political sedition, in front of Pilate, if you look in Luke 23, and that was one of the charges against him. So, any comments or questions so far? All right, then in verses 6 through 8, he even tried to profane the temple, but we arrested him. We wanted to try him under our own law, but Lysias, the commander, intervened. He took him out of our hands by force and ordered his accuser to appear before you. By questioning this man yourself, you will be able to learn all about the things which we are accusing him. All right, so the third thing is Tertullus. He claimed that Paul had tried to desecrate the temple. Now that I know I had already read part of verse 6, but we read it again because the last part of verse 6 that I read there and verse 7 are missing from some manuscripts. So it just, it's one of those things that if you look in King James version, these verses are in there. If you look in the Tree of Life version, those verses are not in there. If you look at the complete Jewish Bible, they are there like I have written it here with these little brackets that show that, okay, there's a little note at the bottom that said some manuscripts don't have this, but we included it because some manuscripts do have it, so that you got the full picture. All right. Now, those particular lines probably would not have helped the Tertullus case there. So, I could see where maybe it would have been left out, and possibly, someone else writing this, I don't know how it could have occurred, would have left it in there. So now this this idea of him trying to desecrate the temple, this was kind of a softening of the Corinthian Jews, the Asian Jews, charged against Paul earlier, that Paul had actually brought Trophimus, a Gentile, into the inner precincts of the temple, and we read about that in chapter 21, verses 28 through 29. Now, the statement of Tertullus that the Jews had arrested Paul, that kind of goes along with Lysias' report that the Jews had also tried to kill Paul on the spot, but probably Tertullus, he left that part out because it would have put the Jews in a bad light, because Jews could not impose the death penalty without Roman permission. So anyway, what he's doing here is he's implying that Felix should put Paul to death, since Rome had given the Jews the right to execute temple desecrators. That was one of the few things that Rome just carte blanche says, okay, Jews, you can do that. All right. Going on. The Judean leaders also joined in the attack, affirming that these things were true. So we see that all the priests, the elders that came down with him, they jumped in on the bandwagon. We're saying, going along with the lawyer, saying, "Yep, that's what happened, all right." And but they had no real eyewitnesses on the thing. They had no evidence. So these they expected that just on the depth of their testimony, on just the fact that here we are, we're all priests in Sanhedrin, and look how important we are, and see our fancy robes and everything, we must be important. They expected Felix to just rule on this and condemn Paul, and allow him to allow Paul to be crucified or killed in one fashion or another. And Felix was not above crucifying people. He had done it many times, and he ruled Judea. He had ruled Samaria. with an iron fist. So the idea of stringing somebody up on a cross was not a problem for Felix. So going on, verse 10, when the governor nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, knowing that you have been judge over this nation for many years, I gladly make my own defense. As you can verify, it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. They did not find me arguing with anyone or inciting a riot, not in the temple or in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city, nor can they prove to you the charges that they now bring against me. So, um, Paul's introduction here, though, where he gets in front of the governor, his introduction was it was sincere, but it was truthful. He says, "For many years you've been a judge of this nation." Well, Felix had contact with the Jews in Palestine over for 10 years. First in Samaria and then in Judea. Paul's introduction was also briefer than the opening statement of Tertullus. It was obviously briefer. So, although Tertullus was supposed to be a skilled orator, Paul demonstrates that his, fewer words and the well-chosen words built their own good case. So he didn't use any flattery, just statement of fact. And it was, these things that Paul had talked about is verifiable that he had been there only 12 days. That was not enough time to stir up a big insurrection. And that he was only in the temple just to worship. That's all he was doing. He was fulfilling his vow. And so basically he's saying, hey, they don't have any evidence. All they are is talking about this case, but they don't have any evidence. They don't have any of the eyewitnesses, because these guys were not eyewitnesses at all. So Paul goes on. He said, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, that's which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything written in the Torah and the prophets. In God I have a hope, which these men also wait for, that there will surely be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore I do my best always to have a clear conscience before God and men. Now, Paul, he rebutted this second charge of leading a cult by explaining that, okay, his beliefs harmonized with the teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures. So, if this was a cult or something, how could that be if he agreed with what the mainstream Jews or the Judaism taught? And so this would have maybe helped Felix understand that the real conflict between Paul and his accusers was religious and not political, like Tertullus made it appear. The mention of the prophets as well as of the law shows that a reference to the messianic. It talks about a messianic hope that that was all intended. Paul was using these so that they could. That Felix would understand that, okay, we're talking about resurrection here. Now, Ananias was a Sadducee, and the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And therefore, Felix must have seen that Paul and Ananias disagreed strongly on this theological point, that Paul was a believer in resurrection, Ananias was not. And really, their political, their theological views were very, very, very far apart. So the Jewish leaders that accompanied Ananias to Caesarea evidently had also included some Pharisees, those who did believe in the resurrection. So it was belief in the resurrection. That was the theologically conservative position of the Jewish people as a whole, and because basically the scriptures, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, uh, teaches it. For examples, would be Psalm 16:10 through 11, and Daniel 12:2. So this um, this verse here that Paul is saying about the resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous, verse 15. This is the only New Testament reference that we have where Paul states his belief in both the resurrection of the wicked and the resurrection of the righteous. That everyone would be resurrected, one to eternal life, the other one to judgment. So, although the scriptures in the New Testament, well, all throughout the scriptures, Old and New Testament, um, they speak of God raising all people to face judgment, one way or the other, either good or bad. And that again, Daniel 12:2, Matthew 25:31 through 33, and verse 46, John 5:28 through 29, and several more. I've got them in my notes here that you can read them. Since Paul believed that God would resurrect him, he says that he sought to maintain a clear and blameless character and conscience while he lived. And so basically he was just saying that because of this, and he knew that there was going to be a resurrection of everybody and that you would be judged. That's why he was tried to live his life as blamelessly as he could. And so here he's framing this more in terms of a religious and not a political argument. So going on, any questions so far with this? I know this is kind of getting in the weeds a little bit, but kind of helps to understand how Paul was building his defense here, because he will be building 3 more defenses before the end of Acts. So going ahead with verse 17. Now, after several years, I came to bring tzedakah to my country for the poor and to present offerings. As I was doing this, they found me in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jewish people from Asia who ought to be here before you to press charges if they have anything against me. So rather than desecrating the temple, Paul said that he had returned to Jerusalem to give money, alms, to the Jews there, and to present his offerings. He had taken that vow, so he was going to present these offerings in the temple. Now, his gift, his money, was for the Jewish believers in Jerusalem. Yet at the same time, since Paul's desire was that the Jewish believers would evangelize the unsaved Jews there, he could actually then honestly say that he had brought alms or offerings and money and help to his nation, all of his country, Israel, all of the nation, all of the people. So alms there, refers to the collection that they had taken up for the people, the believers, the Jewish believers in Jerusalem and throughout that local area. And then the offerings that Paul was delivering to the temple were the expenses to pay for the expenses of the 4 men who were also taking a vow. We read about that back in chapter 21. Now, he said he had just completed his purification rites in an orderly manner. You know, part of that was that he had to go and go through a mikvah, and uh, then so he had already done all of the things that he needed to do. You know, with cutting the hair and all of that kind of stuff for his vow. When these other Jews from Asia came in, and they just stirred everything up. You know, they started a riot, and that's what got Paul in the situation he was in. Now Paul pointed out that his original accusers were not present here. um, they should have or ought to have been there. Now, probably the Sanhedrin ruled that out because, in view of the facts, I mean, if they had started cross examination, it would have been clear that there was no basis for their charges. Now, Roman law uh, imposed a very heavy penalty upon accusers who abandoned their charges. You know, when um, and you know, the disappearance of accusers often meant that the withdrawal of the charge. Basically, if you don't have accusers, then you have no charges against you. So their absence then suggested that there was nothing against Paul that would stand up in a Roman court of law. So that's basically it. If there was no accusers, then there's no case. All right. Any questions? Going on to verse 20. Or let these men themselves tell what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Except for this one cry I shouted out while standing among them, it is about the resurrection of the dead that today I am on trial before you. So Paul's presentation, or Paul's present accusers, these men who, you know, Ananias, the Sadducees, the some of the Pharisees, all of that made up the elders. They could not even testify that the Sanhedrin, the council, had found him guilty, because they couldn't, because they were so split. Remember, they had the ones that don't believe in the resurrection, those that did believe in the resurrection, and they fought against each other as much as that some of them were fighting against Paul. So he said, "Tell me what misdeed they found." You know, when he appeared before that body. Some of them had disagreed on the idea of the resurrection. So, therefore, Paul concluded he was on trial for the issue of the resurrection. This put Felix actually in a very awkward position of trying to, or having to, decide a theological issue over which the Jewish subjects disagreed. So here he was in this Roman civil court, and these people are trying to foist on him the idea of something that should have been settled in a Jewish venue, a Jewish context, a Jewish court. So Richard said, yeah, that even in the Torah, there must be two eyewitnesses present to accuse someone and condemn them. Yeah, if it was a death penalty, then you had to have at least two eyewitnesses, and their testimony was supposed to agree very strongly if they were if a person was to be convicted of a capital crime. So one of the best things, the greatest things about Paul is that, you know, he speaks in his own defense with force, with vigor, and you know, I guess also with indignation. I mean, he was he was one of these guys. He was really in control of himself, and there's nothing you know, nothing that he said was like self-pity or bitterness or anything like that. So you know, you would think that he would have something like that in his testimony, but it wasn't there. So all he did was he got up there and he spoke the truth, and how that he had been misrepresented, and all the statements against him were false, and no, they had no evidence at all against him. So, um, um, going ahead with this, said, but Felix, having a rather extensive knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will rule on your case. Then he gave the centurion orders for Paul to be kept in custody, and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from attending to his needs. So what we Richard was saying, going on there, that said that's why with Yeshua, and they brought the adulteress to him. He says, well, where are the witnesses? And so they didn't have any, so therefore there was no, obviously no case against this woman. So Felix probably gained his knowledge of the Messianic Judaism, the way, from several sources. His wife, his current wife, was Jewish, and she was a Herodian from the Hasmonean family, and maybe he had learned of it from the Romans and the Jews in the area in Judea, and many of the individuals that were there in Israel at that time. Now, because Felix was he was ruthless and everything, but he obviously had some smarts, the way he had brought himself up from being a slave to a governor of a Roman province. And so I'm sure that he kept his finger on the pulse of everything that was going on in his area. And so the idea of this, the way would be something that Felix would have looked into and try to find out as much about it as he could, because if this was a messianic movement that was going to cause problems for his ruling, for his reign, then he would have tried to jump on it and stomp it out very quickly. So here he's at a position where he is going to try to preserve the peace by delaying the trial, and just separating Paul from the accusers. Remember, Lysias had already presented his testimony, so this idea that, well, we're going to wait until Lysias can come up here and talk to me about it. Lysias had written a long letter to Felix telling him about all this. So Felix was stalling, and he figured, well, if I can put Paul away for a couple of years, for a while, and these guys go back to Jerusalem, it'll all boil, it'll all settle down. They won't boil up to this contentious bit anymore. And so if I can just separate these people out, it'll all settle down. So while Paul waited for Lysias, well, he didn't show up because he was down there, and the governor had no intention of bringing him back up there. He was able to enjoy considerable personal freedom. Basically, he was under house arrest, which meant that he stayed there in this Herod's palace there in Caesarea, which, if you remember from the pictures and so forth that I put on here last week, it was pretty extensive. It was very large and very lavish, and so Paul was allowed to pretty much stay right there within the confines of the palace grounds, and he couldn't leave there, but his friends could bring in whatever he needed, food and clothing, writing materials, whatever it was that Paul needed. His friends could come in there, and these were probably guys like Aristarchus, Luke, Luke most surely was there, and Philip the evangelist, who lived there in Caesarea. So there were a lot of believers right around in Caesarea and then outside of Caesarea. So Paul would have been able to have pretty good freedom here. All right, verses 24 and 25. Now, some days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him speak about faith in Messiah Yeshua. But as he was arguing about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became afraid and said, go away for now. When I find time, I will summon you. All right, so let's talk about a little background here. Felix had with his wife, they'd call for Paul later on sometime, we don't know exactly the time frame, but he called Paul up and wanted to talk about this messianic faith. And so Drusilla was his wife. She was his third wife. He had Drusilla was actually about 19 at the time. She was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who had been king over Palestine over Israel. The Roman province of Palestine, what they called it, from 37 A.D. to 44 A.D. Now, this is the Herod Agrippa. That's Herod Agrippa. Was the guy that authorized the death of James, the son of Zebedee, one of the apostles, and had also imprisoned Peter in chapter 12 of Acts. Now, Drusilla was Felix's third wife. They were married when she was about 16, and she was 19 at this time. And she had previously been the wife of Azizus, the king of Emesa, which is a state up there in Syria. But Felix had somehow finagled and got that marriage broken up or annulled or something. And so then he was able to make Drusilla his wife. And so it was, again, Felix got to where he was by very good marriages. He had been married twice before to princesses. The first one was the granddaughter of Anthony and Cleopatra, and so he used these marriages to advance his political career. The Herods there in Israel, of course, they were Idumeans, part Israelite and part Edomite, and so he was just working his way up the political scale here. So eventually, what happened with Drusilla was, 20 years later, so when Mount Vesuvius when it erupted, that she was living there in Pohnpei, wherever Mount Vesuvius blew up there, and I keep saying Pohnpei. That's an island in the Pacific, but anyway, when Mount Vesuvius blew up, she was there and was killed. Now, something about Paul's presentation of the gospel of Yeshua to Felix, somehow it fascinated him. He wanted to hear more and more, and something, though there was a problem here, because when he would talk to him, they were always about the same three things that he talked to him about: Yeshua, was the predicted one of the that the Holy Spirit had predicted would convict people uh, of their um, their sin, basically their self-control, and their righteousness, which and judgment. So Felix, they were really pretty much notoriously deficient of self-control, righteousness, and judgment. They were not known for their high moral standards. Okay, so as long as they're just talking generally about theology, Felix was cool with that. He said no problem. But then when Paul started bringing it home to the idea of sin, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and that there's none righteous, no, not one, and you can just imagine Paul was not one to mince words, and so when he would bring those things in, that the Holy Spirit was convicting Felix in some way. And but when it got to that part of it, boy, it terrified him, because why? Paul said there's a judgment coming someday for the righteous and for the unrighteous, and the unrighteous, it's not going to go well with them. So Felix knew that. He knew he was a bad guy, and uh, he made no pretense of that. So he kept, delaying this, making a decision about his relationship with God, and that's pretty common. Most people are like that. Many put it off and put it off and put it off until they unfortunately slip out of this world without making a decision to follow the Lord. So a lot of people, if they make a decision at all, it's when they're young, and not so much later on. Although I'm encouraged that I've got friends, that I remember when we were in our late teens and early 20s. They were not particularly, let's say, we were not particularly righteous, but nowadays I see some of their stuff on Facebook, and I found out that these guys are now believers, and they're always putting out stuff about uh, believing in Jesus for them, because they're not messianic, but believing in Jesus. So I kind of kid around about it, that these guys, as we're getting older, they're all cramming for finals. So but it's one of those things you don't want to mess with. If you're listening in the sound of my voice and you have not made a decision to follow the Lord, today's the day to do it. And I pray that the Holy Spirit would convict everyone that's listening to me tonight that you need to do that, and give your life over to God. So let's go ahead and get the last two verses in here. At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given to him by Paul, so he sent for him frequently and would talk with him. But after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Judean leaders a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So here again, very typical of Felix, he was looking for a bribe. So we don't know for sure where Paul got the money that Felix hoped Paul would give him, for this bribe, or even if he had it. But maybe he just heard about perhaps the believers that heard about Paul contributed to his support, and he looked at how Paul was being supported here and thought, aha, he's got some money. And the provincial governors were prohibited by law from taking bribes from prisoners, but the practice was common, and in the case of Felix, it was typical. That was character for him. So the 2 years that that Luke referred to here, these were the 2 years of Paul's detention in Caesarea. Now, basically, Felix's superiors relieved him of his position because he had handled a conflict in Caesarea too harshly. There had been a kind of an uprising a little bit, typical things that went on in Judea in those years between the Jewish and the Gentile residents there in Caesarea. Um, and so what he did, he went through there and he just slaughtered a whole bunch of the Jewish people. And so, too many of the Jews had died or been mistreated. So his replacement then, Porcius Festus, um, he served as the procurator of Judea from 59 to 61 A.D. So to appease the Jews, the Jewish leaders, Felix left Paul in prison, and basically Paul became a political pawn in in the will of God. And so it's most likely that that Luke was with Paul all this time, and Luke used these 2 years to do some of the research that he used for writing both the book of Luke and also for Acts up to this point. And so we really don't know, but it was a time of relative peace and quiet for Paul, because here he had no idea of what was coming up ahead of him, but at the same time there was a lot of stability there. He was not traveling, he was not being persecuted, he had his friends could come in and help him. It was just that he couldn't leave the palace grounds. It's kind of like somebody that takes asylum in an embassy, and they can't leave that embassy. That gets kind of confining, but at the same time, it's not something that it's not like being in a dank, dark dungeon with chains on your arms and so forth. Okay. Let's see. We've got some comments here. We just don't know what unforeseen tragedy might be on our immediate schedule, and we simply don't have the luxury of postponing our decision for salvation through the Messiah until we get ready, until we feel ready or clean enough. That's right. You're never going to be good enough to come to the Lord. You got to come just as you are. So Michael McGuckin said, may I suggest that we see some of what God instructed Rothschild to do as the apostle to the Gentiles. His task was to teach the uncircumcised salvation through the atonement of Yeshua. I find him searching for common ground with Felix, but was unable to. I find him searching for common ground with Felix, but was unable to. Okay, and I think Michael is still typing there. So yeah, Paul is never going to pass up an opportunity to preach the gospel and to tell people about the saving grace of Yeshua. That's just not going to happen. He's going to take every opportunity he's got. So here he had been dealing with Felix for 2 years off and on, and so Felix, obviously, to me anyway, obviously there was something tugging at him, that Felix was bad to the bone. He really was, but all of his actions were self-serving, and he was ruthless, but there was something tugging at him that he wanted to find out more and more about Yeshua and all of this. So it's a tragedy. We have there's nothing that would show us or tell us that Felix ever gave his heart to the Lord. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. So it's kind of a shame. But anyway, that's where we leave it tonight, with Paul still under house arrest. And the last slide I had here um, talks about with Felix. He was brought to Rome and basically called to task for his brutality there in Caesarea.